Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest is Daniel Benjamin, who was from 2009 to 2012 the State Department's top counter-terrorism official. He joins us from Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, where he is a professor. Mr. Benjamin, thank you very much for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
So, Mr. Benjamin, of course, terrorism has been pretty much in the headlines in France recently, also in Belgium. We see soldiers on the streets of Paris and other towns. And so this begs the question, is France and maybe to a certain extent Europe going through a kind of 9/11 moment, if you wish?
I think that there is some analogy insofar as clearly the threat perception has gone way up, the sense of vulnerability. We are, of course, talking about a significant difference in scale. 13 or 17 casualties in Paris as opposed to 3,000 on 9/11. But it's clear that this has had a profound effect on France and on Europe more broadly.
I mean, we see European ministers meeting. We know there's supposed to be a major summit in Washington next month. Concretely, what more can be done? A lot has already been done, especially in the US, but also in the Western world, to try to fight or at least contain terrorism. What do you expect from this concretely?
Well, for one thing, I expect European countries to increase their budgets for their security services, for their police, for their intelligence collection. I expect that the coordination between different partners will increase as well. It's quite clear that, for example, the United States continued to have concerns about the Kouachi brothers while France had moved on, and I think it's clear that France is going to go through a period of self-examination to try to understand how that happened. Over the long term, I think that there will be deeper intelligence cooperation, law enforcement cooperation across the Atlantic as well, and I think that that will benefit everyone. I think another thing that probably needs some examination is the Schengen border regime, and whether or not there will be questions as to whether or not that's sufficient. And finally, there will also be a lot of examination, a lot of thinking to be done about prisons in Europe, and I think France has some work to do there, and about whether or not the country is doing everything it can to diminish alienation and do a better job at integrating its Muslim minorities.
Do you think that the current threat is also a threat to the United States? We've seen John McCain saying, well, that an attack like this happened in Europe, but an attack like this is likely in the United States, or do you believe this is an exaggeration?
Well, the United States has had attacks like this already. If you look back just a few years, the shooting at Fort Hood in Texas bears some similarity in that it appears there that the perpetrator, Nidal Hassan, was acting out of a desire to carry out what is called a personal jihad. And I think that the Kouachis and Koulibaly had some kind of similar motivation. The issue of foreign fighters coming home is one that affects Europe and the United States, Europe more directly, of course, because of the larger numbers. I think that we have better screens, better filters for finding out who's traveling into the United States than Europe does. But of course, we're all in the same boat. But that said, I do think that the United States has advanced its counterterrorism policies more than pretty much any other country has over the last 13, 14 years.
You just mentioned the Fort Hood attack, and you mentioned earlier the Kouachi brothers who conducted the attack on the satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo. There seems to be a common thread, and it's Yemen. I'm just wondering if, obviously, you were in government until 2012. There are reports that the two brothers traveled to Yemen back in 2011. Were you aware that there were possible suspects going in and out of Yemen and probably making contact with the local branch of Al-Qaeda at that time?
Of course we were, and this was a matter of great concern. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula after 2009, 2010 was right at the top of U.S. concerns. It was an organization that sought to demonstrate that it had both the capability and the intention of carrying out strikes against the United States and others in the West, which distinguished it from all the other Al-Qaeda affiliates. So this was a matter of great concern. And yes, we were certainly aware that there were people traveling to Yemen and that they were coming in contact with extremists there. And as you know, and has been widely publicized, I only know it from press reports, the United States had informed France about the presence of at least one of the Kawashis in Yemen.
So do you believe clearly that this was a failure by France to follow up, because maybe the focus is more on the so-called jihadists going in and out of Syria right now, and that they forgot that Yemen was maybe the home to the most dangerous franchise of Al-Qaeda?
Well, I don't want to criticize my French colleagues without knowing more of the story. I think historically France has been very much focused on Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and on the situation in Iraq and Syria. But clearly, we can't drop any of these groups from view, and there needs to be a concerted effort to keep tabs on all of the extremists traveling abroad to the many different places that they go. And that now includes, for example, Libya as well.
In terms of tracking, there is this passenger name record known as the PNR that has been in place in the United States for several years. There's been a push to have such a mechanism in Europe. It has not gone through Parliament because of concerns over personal freedom and so on. Do you think, I mean, from experience, that this could be a useful tool, or are the concerns about Big Brother and surveillance real concerns?
So the United States has a PNR agreement with the European Union, and I think it was an important advance. I think we achieved that in 2011. And I think that you know, everything that allows us to track travelers, and in particular travelers who have worrisome associations, is very important. Look, there's always going to be a concern about the trade-offs between privacy and surveillance and security. In my view, this one has been overstated, and that there has been no record of significant abuse of this program, and that it will pay dividends for those who engage in it and who try to spread the network of PNR agreements.
You mentioned that France probably did not pay enough attention to Yemen. You just briefly mentioned Libya. Is the West in general, and the U.S. in particular, paying enough attention to what's happening in Libya and the consequences? Obviously, there's been a lot of criticism, more maybe on the Republican side, sorry, about Obama's dealing with terrorism in general.
Well, I certainly think that the criticism of the president is misplaced and is often driven by partisanship. I think that for the most part, the administration has pursued some very wise policies. I think that on the administration side, there has been a more acute understanding of the dangers of occupation of foreign countries. And we know now, for example, that the occupation of Iraq had a very profound effect on extremists, and that was testified to by the Kawashi brothers and by the statement that Abu Ghraib had an important role in the radicalization of, I believe, Sharif Kawashi. So the president has sought to promote cooperation with partners abroad, and I think that's right. And I think in particular in Iraq, it's important that it be the countries in the neighborhood that are on the first line in dealing with ISIS. This may not always be emotionally satisfying to some of the president's critics, but I do think it's the smart way to go. I have to say, though, that the rise in activity, in terrorist activity in Europe, suggests that there needs to be even more energy going into what is going on in Iraq to counter ISIS because it is ISIS's perceived successes that have been galvanizing extremists in Europe in particular to take action.
Do you believe, and that's my last question, that ISIS is more dangerous than Al-Qaeda ever was?
No, I certainly don't think that. I think that the big achievement of the last decade and a few years is that the threat of high-end, that is to say, extremely complicated, catastrophic attacks that may involve multiple planes, that may involve weapons of mass destruction, that has been greatly diminished. And I think that people have lost sight of how much has been achieved there. We share France's sense of tragedy at what happened there, but it's important to remember that numbers do count, and we're not talking about thousands of deaths. So the threat from the Al-Qaeda core in Pakistan has been greatly diminished. We continue to face a terrorist threat. I think that's going to be our predicament for many, many years to come because there's lots of different ways of carrying out destructive acts. I think ISIS is also principally focused on Iraq and Syria. And while its attention has turned a bit to the West since the United States and its partners have started carrying out air attacks against ISIS, the group's #1 objective remains to hold and secure territory in Iraq and Syria and to create its new caliphate. So I think it is not the threat that Al-Qaeda was, but it's nonetheless something that's going to take some serious attention and some serious energy.
Daniel Benjamin, thank you very much for answering our questions, and thank you for watching this interview here on France 24. Stay tuned for more news.